Number 1. Nannie Doss, the giggling granny who poisoned 4 husbands in search of perfect love. There are crimes that defy easy explanation, cases that force investigators, psychologists, and ordinary people alike to sit with a deeply uncomfortable question. How does someone commit an act of terrible harm not once, not twice, but repeatedly across decades, while the world around them suspects nothing at all? The story of Nannie Doss is one of those cases, a case that unfolded slowly across nearly 30 years of American life, beginning in the cotton fields and farmhouses of rural Alabama and ending in a courtroom in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where a smiling, bespectacled grandmother sat before a judge and confessed to a series of crimes that had left 11 people dead. She was born Nancy Hazel on November 4, 1905, in Blue Mountain, Alabama, a small and deeply isolated community nestled in the hill country of the American South, where families worked the land from sunrise to sundown and formal education was considered a luxury that most could not afford. Her father, James Hazel, was a controlling and demanding man who kept his children away from school for long stretches of time, insisting instead that they contribute to the labor of the family farm, and who imposed strict social rules on his daughters, forbidding them from wearing attractive clothing, attending dances, or socializing freely with the young men of their community. Nannie's mother was considered by those who knew the family to be a warm and loving presence, but she operated in the shadow of her husband's authority, and the household was not a place where a young girl's dreams of romance and tenderness could easily take root. When Nannie was approximately 7 years old, she suffered a significant head injury while traveling by train, when the train slowed abruptly and she struck her head against a metal seat bar in front of her. She would later describe this incident as the source of years of severe headaches, blackouts, and episodes of depression that shadowed her through adolescence and into adulthood, and she would return to this injury repeatedly in later years as an explanation, though not an excuse, for the path her life eventually took. What gave Nannie genuine comfort, what she would describe in her own words as her greatest escape and deepest source of joy, was the stack of romance magazines she read obsessively from the time she was a teenager, particularly the Lonely Hearts columns that published letters from men and women seeking companionship and love, letters that painted a picture of a world where relationships were warm and fulfilling, and where a woman could find in marriage the kind of tenderness and mutual devotion that her own family life had never provided. She dreamed of what she once described as the perfect mate, and it was this dream, this idealized magazine-fed vision of romantic love, that would shape every major decision she made for the rest of her life, including the decisions that ended the lives of the people closest to her. In 1921, when Nannie was 16 years old, her father arranged for her to marry a young man named Charlie Braggs, a co-worker from the linen thread factory where Nannie had taken a job. The marriage had her father's approval, which was the thing that mattered most in that household, and the two were wed quickly after only a few months of acquaintance. The couple moved in together but quickly found that domestic life came with a complication. Charlie's mother moved in with them and assumed a controlling role in the household, limiting Nannie's freedom and demanding a great deal of Charlie's attention, mirroring in an uncomfortable way the dynamic Nannie had grown up experiencing with her own father. Between 1922 and 1927, Nannie gave birth to 4 daughters, but the marriage continued to deteriorate as both partners grew unhappy and unfaithful to one another. In 1927, 2 of the couple's young daughters died under circumstances that were attributed at the time to food poisoning, though investigators would later examine those deaths with far greater scrutiny. Charlie Braggs, for reasons he never fully articulated publicly but which he reportedly described in private as a fear he could not quite name, eventually fled the marriage, taking their oldest daughter Melvina with him and leaving Nannie alone with their youngest child. He was, as history would later recognize, the only husband Nannie Doss ever had who survived the experience of being married to her. After the collapse of the first marriage, Nannie returned to reading her romance magazines and began corresponding through the Lonely Hearts columns with potential suitors, entering into a pattern of relationships and marriages that would define the next 3 decades of her life. Her second husband was Robert Franklin Harrelson, whom she married in 1929 after meeting him through one of these correspondence networks. The marriage proved deeply difficult. Harrelson was an alcoholic with a criminal history, and the household was not the romantic sanctuary Nannie had envisioned. The marriage lasted 16 years before Harrelson died in 1945, a death that was attributed at the time to natural causes, but which would later be revealed to have involved arsenic poisoning. Nannie's third husband was Arlie Lanning, whom she married in 1947, and who died in 1952 under circumstances that were similarly attributed at the time to natural illness. Her fourth husband, Richard Morton, entered her life through another Lonely Hearts correspondence and died in 1953, again from what appeared at the time to be natural causes. In each of these cases, Nannie presented herself to the world as a grieving widow, warm, chatty, and visibly fond of her late husbands in the telling of their stories. And in each case the authorities and medical professionals who reviewed the deaths saw nothing that appeared to require further investigation. The reason the deaths went undetected for so long was straightforward and in retrospect deeply troubling. The men Nannie married tended to have existing health conditions, alcoholism, heart problems, chronic illness, and their deaths, while unfortunate, appeared entirely consistent with those conditions. Nannie's fifth and final husband was Samuel Doss of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a Nazarene minister whom she married in June 1953. Samuel was a quiet, disciplined man who disapproved of Nannie's romance magazines and her television habits and imposed a strict and somewhat joyless domestic routine that Nannie found stifling and disappointing. In September 1954, Samuel was admitted to the hospital with severe flu-like symptoms and a serious digestive infection, where he was treated over several weeks before being released on October 5. He died on October 12, 1954, just days after returning home, and his physician, already suspicious given the timing and the severity of the relapse, ordered an autopsy without delay. The autopsy revealed a quantity of arsenic in Samuel Doss's system that investigators described as enough to kill a horse, and the results were immediately reported to law enforcement. Nannie was arrested within days. The interrogation that followed became one of the most extraordinary in American criminal history, not because of what Nannie said, but because of how she said it. She was cooperative, communicative, and cheerful throughout her questioning, laughing and smiling as she recounted what she had done, chain-smoking cigarettes and chatting with investigators as though she were discussing the weather or a neighbor's garden, rather than a decades-long pattern of harm that had cost 11 people their lives. Reporters who covered her arrest quickly coined the nickname that would follow her into history, the Giggling Granny, and the image of this pleasant-looking, grandmotherly woman laughing as she described her crimes became one of the most unsettling photographs in American true crime history. Nannie confessed to having used arsenic, purchased in the form of rat poison and stirred into food, coffee, and prune cake, to end the lives of 4 of her 5 husbands, as well as her mother, 1 of her sisters, 2 of her grandchildren, and her mother-in-law. She maintained throughout her confession that her motive was not primarily financial, though she had collected insurance payments following each death, but rather what she described as the relentless disappointment of finding that each husband fell short of the ideal she had built in her imagination from years of reading romance magazines. When one husband failed to be the partner she had dreamed of, she removed him and moved on to the next in search of something better, something more closely aligned with the stories she had read. Oklahoma prosecutors built their case around the murder of Samuel Doss, the death for which the evidence was most direct and most recent, and on May 17, 1955, Nannie Doss entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to life imprisonment. The state declined to pursue the death penalty, reflecting in part the attitudes of the era regarding the execution of women. The other 10 deaths she had confessed to were never brought to formal charges, a legal reality that Nannie herself seemed to understand with a kind of philosophical acceptance. She spent the remaining years of her life as an inmate at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, where she continued to read romance magazines and was described by prison staff as pleasant and cooperative. She died of leukemia on June 2, 1965, at the age of 59, taking with her whatever full account of her motives and her decades of harm she might have provided. Her case remains one of the most studied examples of what criminologists describe as the hidden nature of intimate partner harm, a stark illustration of how proximity, trust, and the social expectations placed on women, particularly the expectation of warmth and domestic devotion, can provide a cover so effective that the harm being done goes unseen for an extraordinarily long time. The families of her victims received no formal justice beyond the single conviction that sent Nannie Doss to prison, and the broader question of what drives a person to commit harm so methodically and so persistently while maintaining such a cheerful exterior remains one that researchers and psychologists have continued to examine in the decades since her death. Number 2. Melanie McGuire, the suitcase killer who dismembered her husband and dumped him in the Chesapeake Bay. On the first Sunday of May in 2004, Two fishermen out on the water near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel in Virginia noticed something unusual floating on the surface. A suitcase, dark green, sealed, drifting in the current far from any shore. What investigators found inside that suitcase, and what they found inside two more suitcases recovered from the same area over the following days, set in motion one of the most complex and disturbing spousal murder investigations in New Jersey history. A case that eventually revealed a story of infidelity, premeditation, and an attempt to erase all evidence of a man's existence with a thoroughness that shocked even experienced law enforcement professionals. The perpetrator was Melanie McGuire, born in 1972 in Middletown, New Jersey, a woman whose academic record was exceptional by any measure. She graduated second in her class from nursing school in 1997 after completing a double major in mathematics and psychology at Rutgers University, and she went on to work as a highly regarded nurse at a fertility clinic in New Jersey, a role that gave her detailed medical knowledge and access to pharmaceuticals that would later become central to the prosecution's case against her. By all outward appearances, Melanie McGuire was a successful professional and a devoted mother of two young sons. She had married William Theodore McGuire, a United States Navy veteran known to friends and family as Bill, in 1999, and the couple had built what appeared from the outside to be a comfortable and stable life in Woodbridge Township, New Jersey. In April 2004, they had just closed on a new home in Warren County, a larger property that they planned to move into with their children, a purchase that seemed to represent the kind of forward momentum that characterizes a family doing well. On April 28, 2004, the very same day the closing documents on that new house were finalized, Bill McGuire disappeared. Melanie later told investigators that the couple had argued that evening and that Bill had left and not returned. And in the days that followed, she made no report to police about her husband's whereabouts. She did, however, contact attorneys about divorce proceedings and made an attempt to have certain records removed from a toll authority database, behavior that investigators would later point to as evidence of a consciousness of guilt. When the first suitcase was discovered floating in the Chesapeake Bay on May 5, 2004, the investigation that followed quickly connected it to a missing persons report that had been filed by Bill McGuire's friends and family, who had grown increasingly alarmed by his absence and by Melanie's unexplained explanations about what had happened to him. A composite sketch released by investigators was recognized by the wife of one of Bill's Navy friends, and fingerprint records from an old arrest confirmed the identification. Detectives notified Melanie that her husband's remains had been found. Investigators later noted that during that notification, she did not ask how he had been harmed, a detail that struck them as deeply unusual. The evidence that emerged from the subsequent investigation was extensive and methodical. Forensic analysts found microscopic fragments of human tissue, described in court proceedings as consistent with post-mortem material, inside Bill McGuire's abandoned Nissan Maxima, which had been left in the parking lot of a motel in Atlantic City. The trash bags in which the remains had been transported matched bags found inside the couple's Woodbridge apartment, and adhesive tape recovered from those bags contained DNA consistent with both Melanie and Bill. A medical blanket found in one of the suitcases was traced back to the fertility clinic where Melanie worked. Perhaps most strikingly, investigators recovered the contents of a computer that Melanie had access to and found a series of internet searches that the prosecution would later describe in exhaustive detail to the jury. Searches for undetectable poisons, fatal medication doses, methods of illegal firearm acquisition, information about sedatives, and, explicitly, the phrase "how to commit murder." Records from a gun shop in Pennsylvania showed that Melanie had purchased a .38 caliber revolver and ammunition on April 26, 2004, 2 days before her husband disappeared. Prosecutors argued that she had used her medical training to obtain a powerful sedative called chloral hydrate, allegedly by forging a prescription using a patient's information, administered it to Bill to incapacitate him, then used the firearm she had purchased to end his life inside the couple's apartment. She then dismembered his body and placed the remains into 3 matching suitcases before transporting them to the Chesapeake Bay on what prosecutors argued was a calculated and carefully planned journey. The investigation also uncovered a 2-year extramarital relationship between Melanie and a physician at the fertility clinic where she worked, a relationship that prosecutors argued gave her a powerful motive to remove her husband from the picture. Her defense team, led by prominent attorney Joe Tacopina, argued that Bill McGuire had a known gambling problem and that the real answer to the mystery of his disappearance lay in unpaid debts to dangerous people in Atlantic City, a theory that prosecutors systematically dismantled through witness testimony and physical evidence. After a 6-week trial in which the evidence presented was described by observers as overwhelming in its cumulative weight, a Middlesex County jury deliberated for 14 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on April 23, 2007. Melanie McGuire was convicted of first-degree murder, desecration of human remains, perjury, and possession of a firearm for an unlawful purpose. On July 19, 2007, she was sentenced to life in prison plus 5 years, and the judge's calculation of her parole eligibility date, May 20, 2073, effectively ensured that she would remain incarcerated for the remainder of her natural life. She was 34 years old at sentencing. Melanie McGuire has maintained her innocence continuously since her arrest, has participated in a podcast that re-examined the evidence in her case, and has exhausted all available legal appeals without success. She remains incarcerated at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women in Clinton, New Jersey. Her 2 sons, who were very young at the time of their father's disappearance and their mother's arrest, grew up without either parent in the home. The case became the subject of a 2022 Lifetime television film and continues to generate significant attention from true crime audiences, in part because of the forensic complexity of the evidence and in part because Melanie McGuire's composed, articulate manner, both during the investigation and throughout her trial, made her a figure that observers found deeply difficult to reconcile with the crime she was ultimately convicted of committing. The broader significance of the case lies in what it revealed about the limits of trust within intimate relationships and about the unexpected places from which investigators can reconstruct the truth of what happened. A toll record, a grocery store receipt, fragments of material too small to see with the naked eye, all of it adding up to a picture of events that no single piece of evidence could have established on its own. Number 3. Stacey Castor, the Black Widow of Weedsport who poisoned 2 husbands and then tried to frame her own daughter. There are cases in the history of American criminal justice that become known less for the specific harm committed than for the layer of additional deception that the perpetrator added when she believed the investigation was closing in. Cases where the effort to escape accountability revealed something about the perpetrator's character that the original crime alone might not have made clear. The case of Stacey Castor is one of those cases. A story from upstate New York that began with what appeared to be a tragic suicide and eventually exposed a pattern of deliberate harm spanning 2 marriages, ending in a courtroom moment so extraordinary that it drew national attention and was later dramatized for television. Stacey Castor grew up in New York and entered her first marriage as a young woman, eventually becoming the wife of a man named Michael Wallace, who lived in the Syracuse area and who died in December 2000 at the age of 38. His death was attributed at the time to a heart attack, which was recorded on his death certificate without further investigation, and Stacey, then his widow, collected on his life insurance policy and moved forward with her life. She later married a man named David Castor, and the two established a household together in Weedsport, a small community in Cayuga County, New York. On August 22, 2005, Stacey called 911 to report that David had not come to work that morning and that she was concerned. When investigators arrived at the house, they found David Castor unresponsive, and a cup containing antifreeze, ethylene glycol, a substance that is sweet-tasting, odorless, and deeply toxic to human beings when ingested, was discovered on the nightstand beside him. The death was initially investigated as a possible suicide, as antifreeze ingestion had been associated with self-harm cases in the past, and the circumstances appeared consistent with that possibility on a surface level. However, investigators from the Onondaga County Sheriff's Office were troubled by several details that did not align cleanly with the suicide hypothesis. And as their review of Stacey Castor's background and history deepened, the death of her first husband, Michael Wallace, began to attract fresh scrutiny. Investigators sought and obtained permission to exhume Michael Wallace's remains, and the autopsy that followed produced results that transformed the entire investigation. The toxicology analysis of Wallace's body revealed the presence of ethylene glycol, the same substance found in the cup beside David Castor, meaning that a man whose death had been recorded as a heart attack had in fact been poisoned in exactly the same way as Stacey Castor's second husband. The conclusion that investigators reached was that Stacey Castor had used antifreeze to end the lives of both of her husbands over a period of 5 years, collecting insurance money in each case and presenting herself each time as a grieving spouse. When Stacey Castor became aware that the investigation was closing around her, her response was one that prosecutors would later describe as among the most cold-blooded acts of self-preservation they had ever encountered. Over a period of 2 days, she gave her daughter Ashley Wallace, who was 20 years old at the time and who was Michael Wallace's biological daughter, a series of drinks laced with prescription medications, telling Ashley she was mixing cocktails for the two of them to share. Ashley consumed enough of the substance to fall seriously ill, and when she was discovered and taken to the hospital, she was found to have a dangerous quantity of drugs in her system. Alongside Ashley, investigators found a typewritten note in her name in which she supposedly confessed to having been responsible for both of her stepfather's deaths. An apparent attempt by Stacey Castor to create a document that would shift blame for the murders to her own daughter, who was at that moment fighting for her life in a hospital bed. Ashley survived. The note that Stacey had typed and placed near her daughter's unconscious body became one of the most damning pieces of evidence presented at trial, because forensic analysis of the typewriter, the paper, and the content of the letter pointed directly to Stacey Castor as its author rather than to Ashley. Investigators also noted that the letter contained factual inaccuracies about details of the crimes that Ashley, had she been the actual perpetrator, would not have gotten wrong. The document was not a suicide note from a guilty daughter but a fabrication designed to sacrifice Ashley in order to protect her mother. At trial, prosecutors laid out the full picture of what had happened across the 5 years separating the two deaths, and the jury, presented with the toxicology results from both exhumations, the evidence of the forged note, the documentation of insurance policies collected after each death, and the testimony of the investigators who had painstakingly assembled the case, convicted Stacey Castor of second-degree murder in the death of David Castor, of attempted murder in the near death of her daughter Ashley, and of forging David Castor's will. She was sentenced to 51 years in prison, a sentence that effectively meant she would spend the remainder of her life incarcerated. The case continued to follow her even behind bars. Stacey Castor died of a heart attack in her cell on June 11, 2016, at the age of 48, 7 years into her sentence and well before the full weight of the time she had been given could be served. The broader impact of the Castor case extends beyond the 2 marriages it destroyed. It raised serious questions about how thoroughly initial death investigations in apparent suicide or natural cause cases are conducted, and about how the social assumption that a grieving spouse must be innocent can allow a pattern of harm to persist across years and across relationships without triggering the scrutiny that might stop it. It also placed into sharp relief the extraordinary lengths that some individuals will go to in order to protect themselves from accountability. Lengths that in Stacey Castor's case extended to attempting to end the life of her own child and to manufacturing false evidence that would have sent that child to prison in her place. Number 4. Betty Lou Beets, the Black Widow of Texas who buried 2 husbands in her front yard. The state of Texas executed Betty Lou Beets by lethal injection on February 24, 2000, at the Huntsville unit, making her just the second woman put to death in Texas since the reinstatement of the death penalty, and the circumstances that led her to that execution chamber on that winter evening represent one of the most layered and complicated spousal harm cases in the history of the American South. A story marked by a long personal history of domestic chaos, multiple marriages, accusations of abuse on all sides, and 2 bodies discovered buried on a residential property in the small East Texas community of Gun Barrel City. Betty Lou Beets was born Betty Lou Dunavant on March 12, 1937, in Roxborough, North Carolina, into a household that she and her attorneys would later describe as deeply troubled. She was deaf from childhood, the result of a bout with measles that permanently affected her hearing, and she later claimed that she had been subjected to sexual abuse by her father during her childhood, an account that was contested by other members of her family, but that her defense team would argue was essential context for understanding the trajectory of her life. She married young and frequently, entering into a total of 6 marriages to 4 men over the course of several decades, and her history with her various husbands was marked by a pattern of conflict and violence that ran in multiple directions. In 1970, she shot her second husband, Bill Lane, in the back and was subsequently acquitted of the charge against her after Lane testified that he had threatened her life first, after which, remarkably, the 2 remarried briefly before divorcing again. She later made an attempt to harm her third husband, Ronnie Threlkeld, with her vehicle, and he survived and would later testify against her at trial. Both men who survived her were present and gave testimony at the trial that ultimately sentenced her to death. Her fourth husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, disappeared in 1981, and at the time his disappearance was not thoroughly investigated, as the circumstances did not immediately suggest anything beyond the possibility that he had simply left. Her fifth husband, Jimmy Don Beets, a retired Dallas firefighter whom she married in 1982 and for whose relationship she expressed genuine affection, disappeared on August 6, 1983. Betty reported him missing that day, telling authorities that he had gone out on a duck hunting trip on Cedar Creek Lake and had not returned. A 3-week search located his boat drifting on the lake, with his heart medication and fishing license inside, but Jimmy Don Beets was nowhere to be found. 2 years passed. Then, in 1985, information reached the Henderson County Sheriff's Department from a source that led investigators to take a new look at the property where Betty Lou Beets lived. A search warrant was obtained, and the search of the grounds produced a result that no investigator involved would soon forget. The remains of Jimmy Don Beets were found buried beneath an ornamental wishing well in the front yard, and the remains of Doyle Wayne Barker were found buried beneath a storage shed in the same yard. Both men had been shot in the head multiple times with a .38 caliber pistol that was later recovered and linked to the case. Betty Lou Beets' son, Robert Branson, later testified that his mother had told him in advance of Jimmy Don's disappearance that she intended to harm him, and that he had helped her conceal the body and arrange the scene to suggest that Jimmy Don had drowned while duck hunting. Her daughter Shirley Stegner similarly testified that she had helped bury the remains of Doyle Barker. The family testimony against Betty Lou Beets was presented at trial alongside evidence that she had taken steps to collect Jimmy Don's pension and had sought to take out a life insurance policy on him. Evidence that prosecutors argued demonstrated that the motive was financial gain. Betty Lou Beets was charged with capital murder, specifically, murder for remuneration and for the promise of remuneration, and her trial began in July 1985 in the 173rd District Court of Henderson County. She pleaded not guilty and attempted to shift responsibility for the crimes to her children, a defense that the jury did not accept. On October 11, 1985, she was found guilty of the capital murder of Jimmy Don Beets, and during the penalty phase that followed she was sentenced to death. She was never tried for the death of Doyle Wayne Barker. Over the 15 years between her sentencing and her execution, Betty Lou Beets' attorneys filed numerous appeals, and her case attracted significant attention from death penalty opponents, domestic violence advocacy organizations, and international human rights groups who argued that evidence of the abuse she had suffered, physical, sexual, and emotional, both in childhood and across her adult relationships, had never been properly presented to the jury during the punishment phase of her trial, constituting ineffective assistance of counsel. Her original defense attorney had entered into a contract with Betty giving him the rights to her story for commercial purposes, a conflict of interest that her later legal team argued had fundamentally compromised the representation she received. Despite these arguments, and despite appeals to then-Governor George W. Bush that came from organizations including Amnesty International and the United Nations, the execution proceeded as scheduled. Betty Lou Beets died on February 24, 2000, at the age of 62. The question of what she endured and what she did with that experience remained deeply contested up to and beyond the moment of her execution, a fact that made her case, and the questions it raised about how the legal system addresses the history of those it prosecutes, a subject that legal scholars and advocates have continued to examine long after her death. Number 5. Betty Broderick, the San Diego socialite who spent 20 years in a rage before taking action. The story of Betty Broderick is, at its foundation, a story about a marriage, about what one person invested in a marriage, what was taken from them within that marriage, and what happened when the accumulation of betrayal and loss and legal defeat finally overwhelmed whatever was left of that person's capacity for restraint. It is also, importantly, a story about two people who died, and about the children who were left without parents, and about the long aftermath of a moment of terrible decision that has been examined and re-examined in books, films, television series, and parole hearings over more than 3 decades. Elizabeth Ann Broderick, known to everyone as Betty, was born on November 7, 1947, in Bronxville, New York, into a traditional Catholic family with deep convictions about marriage, family, and the proper roles of men and women within a household. She met Daniel T. Broderick III in college, and the two were drawn together by a combination of ambition, shared values, and genuine romantic feeling. They married young, and the arrangement they entered into was one that Betty later described as a full partnership. She would support Daniel through his graduate education, working to pay the bills and manage the household while he completed his medical degree and then his law degree, on the understanding that once he was established professionally, the family they built together would be built on that shared foundation. Daniel Broderick became precisely what he had set out to become, a prominent and highly regarded attorney in San Diego, eventually serving as president of the San Diego Bar Association and building a successful practice in medical malpractice law. By the early 1980s, the Brodericks were living in La Jolla, one of San Diego's most affluent neighborhoods, with 4 children and a lifestyle that reflected the professional success they had achieved. In the fall of 1982, Daniel hired a 21-year-old woman named Linda Kakehi as his legal assistant. Betty later said that she began to suspect very quickly that the relationship between her husband and his new assistant had moved beyond the professional, and her suspicions proved correct. Daniel and Linda had begun an intimate relationship that would continue and deepen in the years that followed. Daniel denied the affair when Betty confronted him, and the years that followed were marked by a deterioration of the marriage that Betty experienced as both a personal betrayal and a professional one, as Daniel's legal knowledge and courtroom influence, built in part on the foundation that Betty's years of supporting him had made possible, meant that she was at a significant disadvantage in the divorce proceedings that eventually followed. Daniel moved out of the family home in 1985, and a drawn-out, acrimonious, and deeply public divorce process began. Betty later alleged that Daniel used his legal connections to make it difficult for her to find competent representation and to structure the divorce in ways that systematically disadvantaged her. She received a financial settlement that she considered grossly inadequate relative to her contribution to the partnership, and she lost primary custody of her children, a loss that she experienced as the most devastating single outcome of the entire process. Her behavior in the years following the separation became increasingly erratic and hostile. She left profane messages on Daniel's answering machine. She drove her vehicle into the front door of his house. She wrote messages on the walls of his home, and she engaged in a pattern of conflict and provocation that resulted in multiple arrests for various offenses. Daniel and Linda were married on April 22, 1989. Daniel had been warned by people close to the situation that Betty's behavior was escalating in ways that concerned them, and Linda herself had urged Daniel to take protective measures, but Daniel declined to do so beyond employing plainclothes security at the wedding. Betty did not attend. 7 months after the wedding, on the morning of November 5, 1989, Betty drove to the house at 1041 Cypress Avenue in San Diego where Daniel and Linda lived. She had obtained a key to the house from her daughter Kim some time earlier. She entered the house in the early morning hours while the couple were asleep, went up the stairs to the bedroom, and used a 5-shot Smith & Wesson revolver to shoot both Daniel and Linda while they lay in bed. Linda Kakehi Broderick, 28 years old, died immediately. Daniel T. Broderick III, 44 years old, was mortally wounded and died shortly afterward. Betty fled the scene and called a friend to tell her what she had done. She was arrested that morning. At her first trial, which ended in a hung jury, the jurors were unable to reach a unanimous verdict, in part because some members of the panel found the circumstances of Betty's treatment during the divorce to constitute some degree of mitigating context. The court declared a mistrial. A second trial began in December 1991, and this time the jury reached a verdict. Betty Broderick was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. She was denied parole in 2010 and again in 2017, with parole hearings scheduled at intervals thereafter. She remained incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino, California, for more than 3 decades. On April 18, 2026, following a fall that resulted in broken ribs and subsequent medical complications, she was transferred from the prison to an outside medical facility for a higher level of care. Betty Broderick died on May 8, 2026, at the age of 78, while in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, surrounded by her children according to accounts from her family. The case of Betty Broderick has been revisited in multiple formats over the decades: 2 television films in 1992, a miniseries in 2020, countless books and documentaries, and it continues to generate intense and divided public response, with some observers focusing primarily on the lives taken and the children left without a father, and others focusing on what they describe as a systemic failure to address the professional and legal disadvantages Betty faced during a divorce process that they argue was structured against her from the outset. The two perspectives are not mutually exclusive, but they do reflect a genuine and ongoing tension in how the law, public opinion, and popular culture understand cases where harm is committed by someone who has themselves experienced harm. Number 6. Susan Wright, the Houston wife who stabbed her husband 193 times and buried him in the backyard. In January 2003, in a quiet residential neighborhood in northwest Houston, Texas, a woman named Susan Wright led police investigators to a shallow grave in her backyard, where the body of her husband Jeffrey Wright had been buried beneath a layer of freshly turned soil and potting material in a hole that Jeffrey himself had recently dug with the intention of installing a backyard fountain. The discovery, and the evidence that investigators found both in the grave and inside the house, marked the beginning of one of the most contested and intensely debated spousal murder cases in Texas legal history. A case that raised fundamental questions about the nature of self-defense, about the legal system's capacity to recognize and respond to patterns of domestic violence, and about the line between an act of desperation and an act of premeditation. Susan Lucille Wright was born on April 24, 1976, in Houston, and grew up in the city. She was 21 years old when she met Jeffrey Wright in 1997 while working as a waitress in Galveston. Jeff was 8 years older than Susan and worked as a carpet and flooring salesman. Outgoing, social, and, by the account of his friends and colleagues, the kind of person who filled a room. The relationship moved quickly, and Susan became pregnant within the year. She and Jeff married in 1998, shortly before the birth of their first child, a son named Bradley, and a few years later they had a daughter named Kaylee. To those outside the household, the Wrights appeared to be a young family doing reasonably well. They owned their home in northwest Harris County. Both parents were employed, and they had 2 healthy young children. Susan's account of the interior of that marriage was radically different from what was visible from outside. She testified at her trial that Jeffrey had subjected her to physical and emotional abuse throughout the course of their marriage, that his use of cocaine and other substances made him unpredictable and frightening, and that on multiple occasions he had directed his anger at their children as well as at her. On the evening of January 13, 2003, according to Susan's account, Jeffrey returned home after a boxing session and, Susan testified, under the influence of cocaine, became aggressive, struck their 4-year-old son Bradley in the face, and then turned his rage toward Susan. She testified that a confrontation escalated to the point where she feared for her life and ultimately, in a state of terror and confusion, she took hold of a knife and used it in what she described as an act of desperate self-protection. Jeff Wright died from his injuries, 193 separate wound injuries documented by the medical examiner, distributed across his face, neck, chest, abdomen, legs, and arms. The prosecution's account of the same events was entirely different. Prosecutors argued that Susan Wright had deliberately seduced her husband that evening under the pretense of a romantic encounter, had used neckties and a bathrobe sash to restrain Jeff to their bed while he was incapacitated, and had then retrieved a kitchen knife and carried out a premeditated act. They pointed to a $200,000 life insurance policy as evidence of financial motive, and they questioned how the physical evidence, the placement of the injuries, the condition of the room, the manner in which the body had subsequently been buried, was consistent with the self-defense narrative Susan provided. The prosecution's lead attorney, Kelly Siegler, took the unusual step of bringing the couple's actual bed into the courtroom as a demonstrative exhibit during closing arguments, staging a physical recreation of the prosecution's theory of events that witnesses described as one of the most dramatic moments they had seen in a Texas courtroom. On March 3, 2004, after more than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Susan Wright was sentenced to 25 years in prison. She appealed the sentence, and in 2009 the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted her a new sentencing hearing on the grounds that her original legal counsel had provided ineffective assistance during the punishment phase, specifically in failing to present available evidence of Jeff's history of domestic abuse to the jury. At a resentencing hearing in November 2010, new witness testimony about Jeff Wright's behavior was presented, and her sentence was reduced to 20 years. Susan Wright was granted parole in July 2020 and was released from the Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas on December 30, 2020, having served approximately 17 years. The case remained a subject of serious legal and social debate long after her release, primarily because the question at its heart, how much weight the legal system should give to a defendant's account of sustained abuse when that account has not been independently corroborated, has never been fully resolved either in law or in public understanding. Number 7. Clara Harris, the Texas dentist who ran over her cheating husband 3 times in a hotel parking lot. On the evening of July 24, 2002, in the parking lot of the Nassau Bay Hilton Hotel just outside Houston, Texas, a woman named Clara Suarez Harris sat in the driver's seat of a silver Mercedes-Benz and made a decision that was captured in full by a video camera held by the private investigator she herself had hired to document her husband's infidelity. What the camera recorded in the minutes that followed became the kind of evidence that investigators rarely have. A complete, real-time visual record of a crime being committed, seen from beginning to end, preserving every detail without ambiguity or dispute. The footage was played at her trial, reported on by news outlets around the world, and discussed in the media for years afterward as one of the most extraordinary pieces of evidentiary video in the history of Texas criminal proceedings. Clara Suarez was born in Colombia and immigrated to the United States, eventually establishing herself in the Houston area where she became a licensed dentist and built a successful practice. She was a woman of considerable personal ambition and professional accomplishment, and in 1992 she married David Lynn Harris, an orthodontist, in a ceremony held at the Nassau Bay Hilton, the same hotel where the events of July 24, 2002, would eventually unfold. The marriage appeared stable and productive from the outside. The couple ran a network of dental and orthodontic offices together that was highly successful. They lived in an upscale home in Friendswood, and they had twin sons born in 1998. David also had a teenage daughter, Lindsay, from a previous relationship, who spent her school year in Ohio with her mother and her summers in Houston with David and Clara. What Clara did not know, until the spring of 2002, was that David had begun an intimate relationship with a former employee, a woman named Gail Bridges who had worked as a receptionist at one of the couple's orthodontic offices before being let go. When Clara discovered the relationship, she confronted David, who admitted the affair and told her he wanted to end it. The couple began working toward repairing their marriage, and David told a friend in July 2002 that he believed they were going to be able to get through it. He also told Gail Bridges that he intended to take her to dinner one final time to bring the relationship to a close in a way that felt respectful and complete. On the evening of July 24th, Clara received a call from the private investigator she had hired, who had been monitoring David's movements, informing her that David and Gail were not at a restaurant as David had described, but were together at the Nassau Bay Hilton. Clara drove immediately to the hotel, bringing Lindsay, who was spending the summer in Houston, with her in the passenger seat. What followed in the hotel lobby was a heated and chaotic confrontation between Clara, David, and Gail, involving raised voices, physical contact, and a level of public disturbance that witnesses would later describe in their testimony. Clara and Lindsay then returned to the parking lot, where Clara got into the Mercedes-Benz and waited. When David emerged from the hotel with Gail and began walking her toward her vehicle, Clara gunned the engine and drove the car directly toward them. The first impact sent David Harris flying 25 feet across the parking lot. Clara then made a series of additional passes with the vehicle, crossing a grassy median, repositioning, and driving over her husband's body a second time, and then a third, leaving the car parked on top of him before finally stepping out. Lindsay had been screaming throughout the incident and had attempted to escape the car during the assault. David Harris was taken to hospital but died of his injuries that night. He was 44 years old. The entire sequence of events was documented by the private investigator's camera. Clara was arrested at the scene. She initially told reporters that what had happened was an accident and that she had not intended to harm David, only to strike Gail's vehicle. At her trial in February 2003, she maintained a version of this account, testifying that in the heat of the moment she had not fully registered what she was doing. The prosecution argued that the deliberate and repeated nature of the actions captured on video, the multiple passes, the repositioning, the returning to drive over his body, was entirely inconsistent with an accident and was instead evidence of intentional conduct. The jury, having reviewed the video evidence, found Clara Harris guilty of murder. The verdict was accompanied by a finding of sudden passion, a legal concept in Texas that reduces the culpability of an act committed while in a state of intense emotional disturbance provoked by a legally recognized cause. In this case, the direct observation of a spouse with a partner in an adulterous relationship. The sudden passion finding capped the sentencing range at 20 years and a fine of $10,000, which is what Clara Harris received. She was sentenced on February 14, 2003, what would have been her and David's 11th wedding anniversary. She served 15 years of the sentence before being released on parole in May 2018. Her parole obligations were completed in February 2023. Lindsay, who had witnessed everything from the passenger seat of the Mercedes that night, testified against her stepmother at trial. The case prompted extensive discussion about the emotional circumstances under which people commit acts they might never have otherwise committed, about the role of surveillance technology in documenting events that would otherwise be contested, and about the moral and legal weight of sudden passion as a mitigating factor in cases of domestic violence and infidelity. Number 8. Chisako Kakehi, Japan's Black Widow who used cyanide to kill her wealthy lovers. In the years between 2007 and 2013, a woman named Chisako Kakehi moved through the dating agency networks of Japan with a quiet and methodical purpose that investigators would only fully understand in retrospect, after a series of deaths that had each been attributed to illness or natural causes began, through the accumulation of medical records and toxicology results and the testimony of survivors, to reveal a pattern that prosecutors would eventually bring before the Kyoto District Court in one of the most extensively covered criminal trials in modern Japanese legal history. Chisako Kakehi was born on November 28, 1946, in Japan, and grew up during the post-war period of Japanese reconstruction and economic growth. She had a first marriage that lasted 25 years before her husband died of illness in 1994, and after that death she began a new chapter of her life that centered on seeking relationships through matchmaking agencies, which in Japan serve both as social services and as organized networks for connecting individuals, particularly those who are older or widowed, with potential romantic partners. The criteria that Kakehi reportedly specified when approaching these agencies for introductions were consistent and specific. She sought men who were elderly, wealthy, childless, and, critically, who had no close family members who might later ask difficult questions about the circumstances of a death. The men she met through these networks were presented to a companion who was warm, attentive, and seemingly devoted, and who had no apparent reason, in the early stages of a relationship, to arouse any concern. Between 2007 and 2013, a series of men who had become romantically involved with Kakehi died under circumstances that were, in each case, attributed at the time to natural causes. The first was a man named Toshiaki Suihiro, 78 years old, who had lent Kakehi a substantial sum of money, approximately 48 million yen, and who collapsed and lost consciousness on a street in December 2007, shortly after sharing a meal with Kakehi during which she had given him what she described as a health supplement. He was found gasping on the pavement and died not long afterward. Because elderly men with health conditions dying of what appeared to be cardiac or respiratory events was not uncommon, and because no autopsy was performed, the death was recorded without criminal investigation. Over the years that followed, additional men in Kakehi's life died or were harmed in similar ways, a pattern that accumulated without triggering official scrutiny because each individual death, viewed in isolation, appeared to have an entirely reasonable medical explanation. The substance that Kakehi used was cyanide, a compound she had obtained from a job at a printing factory where it was used in industrial processes, and which she administered, according to the court's findings, in the form of capsules placed into drinks or disguised as health supplements. The toxicity of cyanide is rapid and severe, producing an effect that can appear consistent with a sudden cardiac event or respiratory failure, particularly in older individuals already dealing with health vulnerabilities, and particularly in an era when the instinct to perform forensic autopsies on elderly people who died of apparent natural causes was not strong. The investigation that ultimately brought Kakehi's activities to light began with the death of her fourth husband, Isao Kakehi, who was 75 years old when he married her in November 2013 and died of cyanide poisoning just over a month later. His death triggered an autopsy, apparently the result of a physician's concern about the rapidity and nature of his decline, and the toxicology results that came back prompted investigators to begin examining the deaths of other men in Kakehi's past. Traces of cyanide were found in the discarded materials at her Kyoto home, and medical paraphernalia consistent with the administration of substances was found at a separate apartment she maintained. Kakehi was arrested in 2014 and charged with the murders of 3 men, including her husband Isao, and the attempted murder of a 4th man who had survived a poisoning. During her trial, which began in 2017 at the Kyoto District Court, Kakehi initially did not speak, but she eventually made a courtroom statement in which she admitted to the harm she had caused and stated that she had acted out of what she described as deep hatred toward her most recent husband, explaining that he had given large sums of money to other women while giving none to her. When Judge Ayako Nakagawa delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts of murder and attempted murder, she rejected the defense's argument that Kakehi was not criminally responsible by reason of dementia and sentenced her to death by hanging. The Osaka High Court upheld the sentence on appeal in 2019, and the Japanese Supreme Court affirmed it in 2021. Chisako Kakehi died in custody at the Osaka Detention Center on December 26, 2024, at the age of 78, of causes that were listed initially as undetermined, without having been executed. She was reported to have told the court during sentencing proceedings that she would die smiling even if executed tomorrow, a statement that captured something of the composure and absence of conventional remorse that had characterized her conduct throughout the trial. The total financial gain from her activities has been estimated at approximately 1 billion yen, roughly $9 million at the exchange rates of the period, though she subsequently lost most of this through unsuccessful financial market trading, a detail that added a strange further dimension to a case that had already been remarkable in almost every respect. The Kakehi case raised serious questions in Japan about the vulnerability of elderly people seeking companionship, about the ease with which individuals of advanced age can be harmed in ways that are attributed to natural causes, and about the regulation of matchmaking services that operate as intermediaries for people who may not be well positioned to assess the risks of the relationships they enter through those networks. Number 9. Denise Williams, the Florida woman who had her husband shot on a duck hunting trip and collected $1.75 million in life insurance. Michael Jerry Williams, known to everyone in his life as Mike, was a 31-year-old real estate appraiser living in Tallahassee, Florida, who on the cold morning of December 16, 2000, left his home before dawn to go duck hunting on Lake Seminole, about an hour's drive west of the city. He told his wife Denise that he would be back by noon. He never came home, and for 17 years his disappearance remained officially unsolved, attributed by the authorities and by the public to a tragic accident, a presumed drowning in the cold lake on a morning when conditions were difficult and help was too far away to reach him in time. The truth of what happened to Mike Williams on that December morning did not emerge until 2017, when a sequence of events set in motion by an unrelated criminal matter forced a confession that shattered the story that had stood for nearly 2 decades and led to the arrest and eventual conviction of the woman who had been his wife. Denise Williams had grown up in the Tallahassee area and had known Mike Williams and Brian Winchester, a man who would become central to the story since high school. Mike and Denise married, had a daughter named Ansley together, and appeared from outside the household to be a young family navigating the ordinary challenges of early adulthood. What was not visible to those around them was that Denise had been involved in an intimate relationship with Brian Winchester, Mike's own best friend, for an extended period before Mike's death, and that in the period leading up to Mike's disappearance in December 2000, she and Winchester had discussed ways of removing Mike from the picture permanently. Brian Winchester had sold Mike Williams 3 separate life insurance policies in the months before the disappearance, policies with a combined value of approximately $1.75 million, including a $1 million policy purchased just months before Mike died. Winchester later testified in exhaustive detail about what happened on the morning of December 16, 2000. According to his account, he had lured Mike out on the hunting trip to Lake Seminole with the intention of staging an accidental drowning. When the initial plan did not unfold as expected, Mike, once he was in the water, was not pulled under by his equipment as Winchester had anticipated. Winchester used a 12-gauge shotgun to end Mike's life. He then removed the body from the lake, transported it in the back of his truck to a wooded area north of Tallahassee, and buried it beside a small lake. He arranged Mike's boat and equipment to support the story of an accidental drowning, leaving the boat drifting on the lake with Mike's heart medication and other personal items inside, creating what he hoped would appear to be the aftermath of a tragic accident. The initial investigation accepted the drowning explanation. An extensive search produced the drifting boat but no body, and the official conclusion was that Mike Williams had drowned and that his body had been consumed by the wildlife of Lake Seminole, a conclusion that Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams, never accepted. For years, Cheryl Williams pushed investigators to reopen the case, insisting that what had happened to her son was not an accident and that the official explanation did not account for the evidence as she understood it. Her advocacy eventually led the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to open a full review of the case. The investigation stalled for years due to the absence of physical evidence, but the break came from an entirely unexpected direction. In 2016, Brian Winchester, who by that point had married Denise after Mike's death and subsequently divorced her, was arrested for kidnapping Denise at gunpoint in a parking lot. Facing serious criminal charges, Winchester eventually made a decision to cooperate with investigators and provided a detailed confession about what he and Denise had planned and carried out in December 2000. Mike's remains were found exactly where Winchester said they would be, buried in the location he described. The body recovered from that location was identified as Mike Williams, ending the 17-year mystery of his disappearance. Denise Williams was arrested in May 2018 and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. Her trial in December 2018 was a 5-day proceeding in which Winchester's testimony, supported by the physical evidence of the body's location and the insurance records, formed the core of the prosecution's case. The prosecution also presented the wedding band Mike Williams had been wearing at the time of his death, which was placed before the jury during closing arguments. Denise Williams pleaded not guilty throughout and denied that she had known of or participated in any plan to harm Mike. The jury deliberated for 8 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts on December 14, 2018, 18 years and 2 days after Mike Williams had driven away from his home for the last time. She was sentenced to life in prison in February 2019. On appeal in 2020, a Florida appellate court reversed the first-degree murder conviction while upholding the conspiracy conviction, and she was resentenced in September 2021 to 30 years on the conspiracy charge. She is currently serving that sentence at the Florida Women's Reception Center, with a scheduled release date of March 31, 2046. Brian Winchester, who received immunity from prosecution for the murder in exchange for his testimony, was sentenced separately to 20 years in prison for the kidnapping of Denise Williams. Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, who had spent 17 years demanding that her son's case be taken seriously and who had sat through the trial listening to the testimony that finally confirmed what she had believed all along, told the court at the sentencing hearing that justice had been served, and that she had spent years imagining her son clinging to the cold, dark waters of Lake Seminole, knowing that his best friend had betrayed him. It was, by any measure, one of the most devastating victim impact statements in a case already filled with extraordinary human tragedy. Number 10. Mary Winkler, the preacher's wife who shot her husband and walked away with 210 days. On the evening of March 22, 2006, members of the 4th Street Church of Christ in the small western Tennessee town of Selmer, population approximately 4,500, arrived for the evening service to find that their pastor had not appeared. Matthew Winkler was 31 years old, had been the pulpit minister at the 4th Street congregation for a short time, and was described by virtually everyone who knew him in that community as a warm, dedicated, and deeply respected spiritual leader. When church elders went to the parsonage, the house adjacent to the church building where Matthew and his wife Mary and their 3 young daughters lived, they found Matthew Winkler in the bedroom, having died from a shotgun wound to the back. His wife and daughters were nowhere to be found. The investigation that followed revealed that Mary Winkler and her 3 children, Patricia, then 8, Mary Alice, then 6, and Brianna, not yet 2, had driven away from the parsonage at some point after the shooting and traveled more than 300 miles south to Orange Beach, Alabama on the Gulf Coast, where they were located the following day and where Mary was taken into custody. Mary Winkler was born on December 10, 1973, and had been married to Matthew Winkler for approximately 9 years at the time of his death. The two had met through the Church of Christ community, a denomination with deep roots in rural Southern religious life and strong convictions about the nature of marriage, family, and the roles of men and women within a household, and had moved from one congregation to another over the course of Matthew's ministry, eventually arriving in Selmer shortly before the events of March 2006. When investigators questioned Mary about what had happened to her husband, she told them that she and Matthew had been arguing throughout the evening about various matters, including family finances, and that she did not fully remember the moments immediately before the shot was fired, but acknowledged that she had gone to the bedroom closet, retrieved the shotgun that Matthew kept in the home, and that the next thing she heard was the sound of the gun discharging. Matthew Winkler, according to the statement Mary gave to investigators, was lying in bed when the shot struck him in the back. He rolled from the bed to the floor and, still alive at that moment, asked his wife why she had done it, to which she responded with an apology before leaving the house with her daughters and beginning the drive south. The investigation that followed and the trial that resulted were shaped profoundly by the decision that Mary Winkler made when she took the stand in her own defense. A decision to describe in detail and in front of a packed courtroom and a national media audience the nature of the marriage as she had experienced it from the inside. She testified that Matthew Winkler had subjected her throughout their 9-year marriage to a pattern of emotional and verbal abuse, criticism, belittlement, and blame, and that he had also compelled her to participate in sexual activities that she found deeply uncomfortable and that she described in court with a specificity that visibly shook many of those present in the courtroom. She produced a pair of platform shoes and a blonde wig as physical items that she said Matthew had required her to wear, and the image of a minister's wife standing in a courtroom displaying these objects as evidence of what had happened behind the closed doors of their parsonage was one that commentators struggled to process within the framework of the community and the denomination that Matthew Winkler had represented. Mary Winkler also testified that the financial troubles the couple had been experiencing in the period leading up to the shooting, troubles that prosecutors argued she had been attempting to conceal from Matthew, including involvement with a fraudulent email scheme known colloquially as the Nigerian scam that had cost the family significant money, had created a level of tension and fear in the household that she had not known how to resolve through any other means. Prosecutors sought a conviction for first-degree murder, arguing that the shot to Matthew's back as he lay in bed, combined with Mary's flight from the scene, were inconsistent with the accidental or emotionally reactive account she provided and were instead evidence of intentional and premeditated conduct. The jury, after deliberating for 8 hours, returned a verdict that represented a significant departure from what the prosecution had sought: guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not first-degree murder. The finding reflected the jury's conclusion that while Mary Winkler had caused her husband's death, the circumstances as they understood them, including the history of the marriage she had described, placed the act in a category that the law treated less severely than premeditated intentional killing. Judge J. Weber McCraw sentenced Mary Winkler to a 3-year term, of which only 210 days would be served in a correctional setting, with 60 of those days permitted to be spent in a mental health facility receiving therapeutic treatment, and the remainder of the sentence to be served on probation. Credit for the 5 months she had already served while awaiting trial meant that the actual additional incarceration time remaining after sentencing was extraordinarily brief. She was released from the mental health facility in August 2007 and returned to life in the community of McMinnville, Tennessee, where she had been living with friends while on bail during the trial. In August 2008, she was granted full custody of her 3 daughters, who had been in the care of Matthew Winkler's parents since his death. The Winkler family, Matthew's parents and other relatives, responded to the custody decision with deep grief and opposition, and the battle over the children's placement reflected the broader division of feeling that the entire case had provoked. The sentence that Mary Winkler received, 210 days for the death of a 31-year-old minister, generated intense national debate that continued long after she had completed her probation and rebuilt her life. For some observers, the verdict and the sentence were evidence that the legal system had finally begun to take seriously the context in which some acts of harm occur, that the experience of sustained abuse within a marriage can produce a psychological state that existing legal frameworks have historically been poorly equipped to address. For others, the outcome raised serious questions about whether the abuse Mary described had been adequately corroborated, and about whether the brevity of the sentence adequately reflected the gravity of what had been lost. Matthew Winkler's family members continued to speak publicly about his memory and about their belief that the account of him presented at trial did not reflect the man they had known. The case of Mary Winkler remains, decades later, a reference point in legal and academic discussions about voluntary manslaughter, about the evidentiary challenges of presenting a history of domestic abuse in a criminal defense, and about the profound difficulty of judging, from the outside, what truly exists within the 4 walls of a marriage.